Marcus Chen had not thought about the fortunate son in 3 years, and he never expected to see her again. But life had a funny way of dragging people back to the things they tried to leave behind. The old freighter sat exactly where he had abandoned her in the rust-colored sands of Kepler Station's salvage yard, and she looked terrible, and Marcus felt a pang of guilt when he saw her condition. Her hull was covered with micrometeorite scars, and the port engine nacelle hung at an angle that made his mechanic's soul ache, and the paint had faded from proud blue to a sickly gray, and weeds from the station biodome had started growing up her landing struts. But Marcus was not here for nostalgia, and he was here for survival because his current ship, the Second Chance, had fried her navigation computer, jumping through a radiation storm last week, and replacement parts in the outer colonies cost more than most people made in a year. The fortunate son still had a backup nav computer gathering the dust in her bridge, and that computer was going to save Marcus about 6,000 credits and 3 weeks of waiting for a shipment from the core worlds. He walked across the salvage yard with his toolkit over his shoulder, and the twin suns of Kepler were setting behind the mountains and casting long shadows across the graveyard of abandoned ships. The yard manager had given him a temporary access code without even looking up from her card game, and nobody cared about ships that had been sitting in the yard for years, and Marcus was technically still the owner, even if he had stopped paying storage fees 18 months ago. He reached the fortunate son and stood at the base of her loading ramp for a moment, and memories flooded back because this ship had been his home for 5 years, and he had hauled cargo across 12 star systems in her belly, and he had nearly died twice when her systems failed at the worst possible moments, but she had also kept him alive through a pirate attack and a solar flare and a navigation error that had stranded him in deep space for 2 weeks, and she was a good ship. Even if she was old and tired, Marcus punched the access code into the exterior panel and waited as the airlock cycled with a groan of protest, and the sound was worse than he remembered, and the seals were probably degraded, and the environmental systems were definitely offline. The inner door slid open with a screech of metal on metal, and Marcus stepped inside and flicked on his helmet light because the interior was pitch black, and then he froze. Someone had been living here. The cargo bay had been transformed from the empty metal box he remembered into something that looked almost like a home. And salvage blankets formed a nest in one corner, and strange bioluminescent plants grew from cracked containers and cast a space in soft blue-green light symbols he did not recognize were scratched into the walls in intricate spiral patterns. And they covered nearly every surface, and they looked like they had been made with a sharp tool over many months. There were food containers, stacked neatly against one wall, and water recycling equipment that looked like it had been cobbled together from a dozen different sources, and a small heating unit that glowed with faint warmth. Marcus reached slowly for the pistol on his hip, because whoever was living here might not be friendly, and squatters in abandoned ships were usually desperate people, and desperate people did desperate things. Then he heard the scream. It came from the corridor that led to the crew quarters, and it was high and sharp and filled with pure terror, and it made Marcus flinch even though he had heard plenty of screams in his life. Something crashed in the corridor ahead, and the sound of running footsteps echoed through the metal halls, and Marcus barely had time to raise his hands before a blur of motion came around the corner and slammed into him. He hit the bulkhead hard, and the back of his head rang against the metal, and stars exploded across his vision, and when they cleared, he found himself staring into a face that was almost human, but not quite. Wild eyes looked at him, and they were too large, and the pupils were vertical like a cat, and they caught the bioluminescent light and reflected it back in shades of amber and gold. Her skin was pale violet like the first light of dawn before the sun rises, and her hair was like strands of liquid silver that floated around her head as if gravity affected it differently, and she was absolutely terrified. Her hands pressed against his chest with surprising strength, and she was pinning him against the wall, and she was breathing fast and shallow and making small sounds of fear in her throat. She hissed something in a language his translator could not parse, and the words were full of sharp consonants and rising tones, and they meant nothing to him, but the meaning was clear. She thought he was going to kill her. Marcus kept his hands up and visible, and he did not reach for his weapon, even though every instinct told him to defend himself. And he could see that she was not attacking, and she was checking him for weapons and looking for threats. She was scared and not dangerous, and there was a difference that most people failed to understand. "Wait," Marcus said, and he kept his voice low and calm and steady, like he was talking to a frightened animal. She flinched at the sound of his voice, and her grip tightened on his jacket and her claws. Yes, she had claws dug into the fabric. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus said slowly and clearly, and he hoped his translator was working, even if hers was not, because tone carried meaning across species, and calm was calm in any language. She stared at him, and her breathing was still fast, but something shifted in her expression, and her head tilted to one side in a gesture that looked almost like confusion. "This was my ship," Marcus continued, "and I just came for a part, and I did not know anyone was living here, and I'm sorry for scaring you." The alien woman did not release him, but her grip loosened slightly, and she was studying his face with those strange amber eyes. And she was looking for something, and Marcus did not know what. He stayed perfectly still and kept his hands up and waited, because sometimes waiting was the only thing you could do. Finally she spoke, and this time his translator caught the words, even though they came out stilted and formal, like she was speaking through a machine that did not quite understand context. "You are not reaching for your weapon," she said, and it was half statement and half question. "No," Marcus agreed, "you are not calling for others to come. No, you are speaking to me like I am a person." Marcus blinked, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach, because that sentence told him more about her life than hours of conversation could have. "Yes," he said, "and why would I not?" The alien woman stared at him for a long moment, and something like wonder crept into her terrified expression, and she slowly released his jacket and stepped back, and her hands were shaking. "Humans," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Are not supposed to talk first." Marcus lowered his hands slowly, and he did not make any sudden movements, and he kept his posture open and non-threatening. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked. She wrapped her arms around herself, and she suddenly looked very small and very tired and very alone. "You are supposed to shoot," she said. Her name was Valkyra Sen, or at least that was as close as Marcus could pronounce it, and she was the Zari from a species he had never heard of, and she had been hiding in his abandoned ship for 11 standard months. They sat on opposite sides of the cargo bay with the bioluminescent plants casting strange shadows on the walls, and Marcus had his back against a cargo container, and Valkyra had her back against the nest of blankets she had built in the corner. She watched him like he might lunge at any moment, and her body was tense and ready to run. And Marcus understood that kind of fear because he had seen it before. Refugees fleeing war zones and survivors of pirate attacks. So he stayed where he was, and he kept his hands visible. And he spoke slowly and clearly, and he gave her space to breathe. "Your people have a reputation," Valkyra said, and her translator had finally synced with his, though the words still came out stilted and formal. Marcus raised an eyebrow and waited for her to continue. "Humans," she said, and she spoke the word like it was something dangerous. "And the galaxy speaks of you in whispers, and they say you are violent and unpredictable, and they say you conquered your own world through endless war." Marcus could not argue with that, because human history was not exactly peaceful. "They say you spread to the stars carrying weapons that could crack planets," Valkyra continued, "and they say your ships are crude but effective, and they say you fight like cornered animals even when you are outnumbered." "Also true," Marcus admitted. She tilted her head, and her silver hair caught the blue-green light and shimmered like water. "Then why are you sitting there?" she asked. And why are you not doing any of those things? Because I do not want to hurt you, Marcus said, and because you are obviously scared and hiding from something, and because shooting refugees is not really my style. Valkyra stared at him for a long moment, and her amber eyes searched his face, and Marcus got the feeling she was trying to solve a puzzle that did not have an answer. This is unexpected, she finally said. Marcus almost laughed, but he held it back because he did not want to startle her. Look, he said, and I'm just a cargo hauler, and I came here for a navigation computer, and I did not expect to find anyone, and I definitely did not expect to find someone who thinks humans shoot first and ask questions. Never is that not true. Sometimes, Marcus admitted, and some humans are violent, and some humans are cruel, and we have done terrible things throughout our history, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Valir waited, and her claws tapped nervously against her knee. But he continued, and we have also done remarkable things, and we have fought wars to free slaves, and we have built hospitals to heal strangers, and we have crossed the universe because we wanted to know what was out there. He shrugged and leaned back against the container. We are complicated, he said. Valkyra was quiet for a long time, and the bioluminescent plants pulsed gently, and somewhere in the ship a pipe groaned, and the silence stretched between them. Like a living thing, she told him her story in fragments, like she was testing how much she could trust him with each piece, and Marcus listened without interrupting, because sometimes listening was the most important thing. The Zari were a client species of the Dominion, which was a vast empire that Marcus knew only from scattered reports and rumors, and the occasional warning from station authorities. The Dominion controlled hundreds of star systems and thousands of species, and they had been expanding for longer than humans had been in space, and they were not kind masters. Valkyra and her people served as bureaucrats and technicians and servants, and they processed paperwork and maintained equipment and cleaned the homes of their masters, and they had been doing this for so long that most the Zari did not remember what freedom looked like. They did not own property, and they did not travel freely, and they did not make choices about their own lives, and they were born into service, and they died in service. And that was simply how things were. But Valkyra had been different, and she had asked questions that the Zari were not supposed to ask, and she had looked at the stars and wondered what lay beyond the borders of Dominion space. And then she had been selected. The Vide word she used did not translate cleanly, and Marcus had to ask her to explain, and when she did his stomach turned cold. She had been chosen as a gift for a Dominion lord named Kethvus, and she was to be his property in every sense of the word, and she would belong to him completely, and she would have no rights, and no freedom, and no hope of escape, because I was to be gifted, Valkyra said, and her voice was flat and empty, and to a Phi-Aeon Dominion lord, and as a thing to own. He looked at the floor, and his silver hair fell around her face like a curtain. I decided I would rather die free than live as property. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, and it was an old familiar anger that had driven humans to war many times throughout their history, and it was the anger of seeing someone treated as less than a person. How did you escape? He asked. Valkyra almost smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. I was clever, she said, and I stole passage on a cargo vessel, and I hid in shipping containers, and I crawled through service ducts, and I bribed a dock worker with the only valuable thing I had, which was information. She touched the silver strands of her hair absently. I traveled for 6 months, and I moved from ship to ship and station to station, and I went further and further from Dominion space until I reached the edges of your territory. Why human space? Marcus asked. Because everyone fears you, she said, and everyone says humans are dangerous and unpredictable and violent, and I thought that the Dominion would not follow me here because even they are careful around humans. She gestured at the cargo bay around them. I found this ship abandoned and forgotten, and I made it my home, and I thought I was safe. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and he thought about what she had told him, and he thought about the history of his own species, and he thought about all the times humans had fought and died for the simple idea that people should be free. You know, Marcus said, finally, and in human history, we had people who thought they could own other people too. Valkyra looked up, and her amber eyes met his. What happened to them? She asked. A thin smile crossed Marcus' face, and it was not a happy smile, but it was a determined one. We fought a lot of wars to prove them wrong, he said. Marcus should have taken his navigation computer and left, and that was the smart play, and that was the safe play, because getting involved with the Zari refugee meant getting involved with the Dominion, and the Dominion had warships that could reduce human colonies to ash. He knew this, and he understood the risks, and he had survived in space for 15 years by making careful decisions and avoiding unnecessary complications, and keeping his head down when trouble came looking. But when he looked at Valkyra sitting alone in the cargo bay of his abandoned ship, surrounded by the small, sad life she had built for herself in hiding, he could not make himself walk away. So instead of taking his navigation computer and leaving, Marcus found himself returning to the Fortunate Sun the next day with food and water, purification tablets, and a heating unit that actually worked. Valkyra stared at the supplies like they might bite her, and her amber eyes were wide with confusion and suspicion and something that looked almost like fear. Why, she asked, and her voice was small. Because you need help, Marcus said, and I can get it. That is not how the galaxy works, maybe, Marcus replied, and that is why humans do things differently. Valkyra did not touch the supplies for 3 days, and Marcus learned this because he came back again and found them exactly where he had left them, and she had not eaten any of the food or used the heating unit. He sat down on a cargo container and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Valkyra asked the question that had clearly been burning in her mind. What do you want from me? Nothing, Marcus said. She shook her head, and her silver hair swayed with the movement. No one gives without wanting, and that is the first law of the universe, and even kindness has a price. Marcus thought about that for a moment, and he thought about all the times in human history when people had helped strangers expecting nothing in return, and he thought about the volunteers who rushed into burning buildings, and the doctors who traveled to disaster zones, and the ordinary people who opened their homes to refugees. I want you to not starve to death in my old ship, he said, and I want you to be safe, and I want you to have a chance at a real life, and I do not want anything from you except maybe for you to eat the food before it goes bad. Valkyra stared at him, and her expression shifted through several emotions that Marcus could not identify, and finally, she picked up one of the food packages and examined it like it was a foreign artifact. Humans are strange, she said. We get that a lot. Marcus admitted. Over the following week, something shifted between them, and it happened so gradually that Marcus did not notice it at first. But Valkyra began to relax around him. It was small things at first, like the way she stopped flinching when he entered the cargo bay, and the way her shoulders dropped from their constant tension, and the way she started asking questions. Instead of waiting for him to speak, she asked about humans and about Earth, and about the strange species that had burst onto the galactic stage only a century ago and somehow had not been conquered or exterminated. How did you survive? She asked one evening as Marcus installed a new air recycler he had salvaged from the yard. And the universe is full of old empires and powerful species, and you are so young and so few. Marcus tightened the bolt and considered the question. Stubbornness mostly, he said, and we are really, really stubborn. That cannot be enough. It is not. Marcus agreed, and we are also adaptable, and we learn fast, and we work together when we need to, and we never give up, even when giving up would be the smart thing to do. He finished with the recycler and wiped his hands on his pants. And we fight, he said, and when someone tries to take what is ours, we fight back harder than they expect. And we keep fighting until they decide we are more trouble than we are worth. Valkyra was quiet, and she had that look on her face again, like she was solving a puzzle. "Your species almost destroyed itself," she said, "and I have read the histories, and I know about your wars and your weapons and your capacity for violence against each other." "Yes," Marcus said, "and we are not perfect, and we have done terrible things, and we still do terrible things sometimes." "Then how are you still here?" "Because the same stubbornness that makes us fight each other also makes us refuse to die," Marcus said, "and we have clawed our way out of ice ages and plagues and wars that should have ended us, and every time something knocks us down, we get back up." He looked at her and smiled. "We are survivors," he said, "and it is what we do." Valkyra processed this, and Marcus could see her worldview shifting as she tried to fit humans into the categories she understood and failed. "You are insane," she said, but there was something like wonder in her voice. Probably Marcus agreed, but we're still here. Then the Dominion came. The bounty hunter ship dropped out of faster than light travel 3 days later, and it was a sleek predator called a Kethrani, and it bristled with weapons, and it landed at Kepler Station like it owned the place. Marcus heard about it from the yard manager, who mentioned it casually while he was signing in for his daily visit to the phase. "Fortunate son, strange ship came in today," she said without looking up from her cards, "and big ugly thing with lots of guns, and the pilot is some kind of lizard creature asking questions about refugees." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. What kind of questions, he asked, and he kept his voice casual about a runaway slave from something called the Dominion, the manager said, and about ships in the salvage yard, and about humans who might be helping her. She finally looked up, and her eyes were sharp. "You would not know anything about that, would you, Chun?" Marcus shook his head and lied through his teeth, and then he walked to the fortunate son as fast as he could without running. Valkyra knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face, and her brief period of peace shattered, and the fear came rushing back, and she was shaking before he even finished explaining. "You need to leave," she said, "and this is not your fight, and the Vorax will kill you." Marcus was checking the charge on his sidearm, and it was an old model military surplus from the Contact Wars, and it was reliable and powerful and very illegal in most of human space. "Probably try," he said. "You do not understand," Valkyra said, and her voice was rising, "and the Vorax are Dominion enforcers, and they are bred for violence, and they have killed thousands, and they do not stop, and they do not show mercy." "I know what they are," Marcus said, and he holstered the weapon, "and I have seen what happens when people do not stand up to bullies, and it is never pretty. This is not your concern." "You were in my ship," Marcus said, and he met her eyes and held them, "and that makes it my concern." Valkyra stared at him like he was speaking a language she could not translate. "Humans make no sense," she said. "We get that a lot." Marcus had spent the day preparing as best he could, and he had moved Valkyra to the most defensible part of the ship, which was the engine room with its thick bulkheads and multiple exit points, and he had checked every weapon he owned twice. Valkyra had tried to convince him to leave at least a dozen times, and each time he had refused, and each time she had looked at him with that mixture of confusion and fear and something else. "That might have been hope. You are going to die for me," she said. As the light outside turned red and gold, "I am going to try very hard not to die," Marcus said, "and dying is not part of my plan." "You have a plan." "I have the beginning of a plan," Marcus admitted, "and I am working on the rest." The Vorax announced itself by crashing through the Fortunate Son airlock like it was made of paper, and the sound of tearing metal echoed through the ship, and Marcus felt the deck shake beneath his feet. He had positioned himself in the corridor leading to the engine room, and he had his back to a bulkhead and his pistol in his hand, and he waited. The footsteps were heavy and slow and deliberate, and they rang against the metal floor like drums. And Marcus counted them and measured the distance and tried to slow his racing heart. Then the Vorax came around the corner, and Marcus understood why the galaxy feared them. It was 8 feet tall at least, and it was covered in armored scales that gleamed like black metal, and its eyes were red and burning with hunger, and its mouth was full of teeth that were designed for one thing and one thing. Only muscles rippled beneath the scales, and each arm was as thick as Marcus' entire body, and the claws at the end of its fingers were curved and sharp and stained with something. Marcus did not want to think about it. It wore a harness covered in weapons and trophies, and some of the trophies looked like they had once belonged to people, and Marcus felt his stomach turn. Of Orcs stopped when it saw him, and its head tilted to one side, and a sound came from its throat that might have been laughter human. It said, and his voice was like gravel scraping against stone, and you are between me and my prey. Marcus did not move, and he did not lower his weapon. Turn around and leave, he said. The Vorix laughed again, and it was an ugly sound that made Marcus' skin crawl. I am here for the Thessari runaway, it said, and she belongs to Lord Kethvis, and she will be returned, and anyone who stands in my way will die, and that is not a threat, and it is simply what will happen. She is not going anywhere, Marcus said. Vorix studied him, and its red eyes moved up and down his body, and Marcus knew it was assessing him as a threat, and finding him wanting human. The Vorix said, and you are small and soft and fragile, and your kind has only been in space for 100 years, and you do not understand how the galaxy works. It took a step forward, and Marcus tightened his grip on his pistol. The Dominion has ruled for 10,000 years, the Vorix continued, and we have crushed species that were old when your ancestors were crawling in the mud. And we do not fear you, and we do not negotiate with you, and we take what belongs to us. Marcus felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, and it was not fear exactly, but it was close, and it was the knowledge that he was probably about to die, and the certainty that he was going to fight anyway. Step aside, the Vorix said, and I will grant you the mercy of a quick death counter. Offer, Marcus said, and you leave now, and I let you live. The Vorix stared at him for a long moment, and then it threw back its head and laughed, and the sound filled the corridor and bounced off the walls, and Marcus used that moment to aim. The Vorix stopped laughing, and its red eyes narrowed. You cannot hurt me, it said, and your weapons are toys, and your species is weak, and you should be on your knees begging for mercy. Marcus thought about all the times in human history when someone had told his species they were weak, and all the times humans had proven them wrong, and all the blood that had been spilled by people who underestimated what a human would do when they were fighting for something they believed in. Maybe he said, and but I do not think I will kneel. The Vorix charged. It moved faster than something that Psi should be able to move, and it crossed the distance between them in less than a second, and its claws reached for Marcus' throat, and its teeth gleamed in the dim light. But Marcus had been watching its muscles, and he had been measuring its speed, and he had been waiting for exactly this moment. He did not try to block, and he did not try to run, and instead he moved into the attack and dropped to his knees. Slid under the Vorix's grasping arms and fired 3 shots, directly into the joint where the armor plates met at the shoulder. The weapon was military surplus from the contact wars, and it had been designed to punch through vehicle armor, and did its job. The Vorix screamed, and it was a sound of pure surprise and pain, and its right arm went limp and hung uselessly at its side, and black blood sprayed across the corridor walls. Marcus was already moving, and he rolled to his feet behind the creature and pressed his weapon to the base of its skull, where the scales were thin and the bone was close to the surface. The Vorix froze. Here is what you are going to do, Marcus said, and his voice was steady and calm even though his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The Vorix snarled, but it did not move. You are going to go back to your ship. Marcus continued, and you are going to leave this system, and you are going to tell whoever hired you that the Thessari is under human protection now. The Vorix trembled with rage, and Marcus could feel the vibration through the barrel of his weapon. And if they want her, he said, and they can come through us, the Dominion will destroy you. The Vorix growled, and we will burn your worlds, and we will enslave your people, and we will. The Dominion can get in line. Marcus said, and his finger tightened on the trigger. And choose the corridor was silent, except for the drip of black blood on metal, and Marcus waited and the Vorix waited. And somewhere behind them, Valkyra watched through a crack in the engine room door. The moment stretched, and Marcus knew that the Vorix was calculating, and it was weighing its pride against its life, and it was deciding whether dying here was worth. The satisfaction of killing one humani will remember you, the Vorix finally said. Good. Marcus said, and tell your masters what happened here, and tell them what a human did when they came for someone under his protection, and tell them to think very carefully before they send anyone else. The Vorix turned slowly, and Marcus kept his weapon trained on its skull as it walked back down the corridor and through the ruined airlock and out into the salvage yard. Marcus watched until it disappeared into the darkness, and then he lowered his weapon and his hands started shaking, and he had to lean against the bulkhead to keep from falling down. The engine room door opened, and Valkyra stepped out, and she was crying, and her silver tears ran down her violet cheeks, and she was staring at him like he was something impossible. You did it, she whispered, and you actually did it, and you won. Marcus laughed, and it came out shaky and breathless. I really thought that was not going to work, he admitted. Vela crossed the distance between them, and she stopped in front of him, and she looked up at his face, and her amber eyes were bright with tears and wonder and something else. Why? She asked, and why did you do that? And why did you risk your life for me? Marcus thought about the question, and he thought about all the complicated answers he could give, and all the philosophical justifications, and all the historical precedents, because it was the right thing to do, he said, and sometimes that is enough. Kira stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something she had never done before, and she reached out and touched his hand, and her fingers were cool and trembling, and she held on like he was the only solid thing in the universe. Thank you, she sighed. Words spread faster than Marcus expected, and it spread through channels he did not even know existed. A human had faced down a Vorix enforcer, and won, and that was the kind of story that traveled, and it traveled far, and it traveled fast. Within a week, the tale had reached the edges of Dominion space, and within a month, it had spread to species that Marcus had never heard of. And it grew in the telling the way stories always do. Some versions said he had killed the Vorix with his bare hands, and some said he had an army of human soldiers backing him up, and some said he was a legendary warrior from Earth Military Special Forces. The truth was simpler and messier, but the truth did not matter as much as the hope, because for species living under Dominion rule, the story was not about what happened, and it was about what it meant. And it meant that the Dominion was not invincible, and it meant that someone had said no and survived. And that changed everything. The first refugee arrived 3 weeks after the Vorix left, and she was a small creature called a Kiduri with 4 arms and fur the color of autumn leaves, and she had walked across half the station to find the salvage yard. She had heard the story, and she wanted to know if it was true. And she wanted to know if humans really protected people, and she wanted to know if there was room for one more. Marcus looked at Valkyra, and Valkyra looked at Marcus, and neither of them knew what to say. Come in, Marcus finally said. And are you hungry? 3 more came the next day, and then 7 the day after that, and then Marcus stopped counting because the numbers kept growing, and the cargo bay of the Fortunate Sun was filling up with frightened people who had nowhere else to go. There were Cathari and Sarashi and Volmani and species whose names Marcus could not pronounce, and they had all heard the story, and they had all made the dangerous journey to human space, and they had all risked everything for the chance of freedom. Some had escaped from Dominion ships, and some had fled from client worlds, and some had been passed from smuggler to smuggler across dozens of star systems, and they were tired and scared and hungry, and they looked at Marcus like he could save them. What have you done? Valkyra asked one evening as they stood in the doorway of the cargo bay and watched the refugees settle in for the night. The space had been transformed again, and it was no longer the hiding place of one lonely The sorry but a crowded shelter full of blankets and makeshift beds and the soft sounds of people trying to sleep. Marcus looked at the huddled figures, and he looked at the fear and hope in their strange eyes, and he looked at the impossible situation he had somehow created. I have no idea, he admitted, but I think we are going to need a bigger ship. Valkyra laughed, and it was the first time. He had heard her laugh, and it was a bright, startling sound that made several of the refugees look up in wonder. It was the sound of someone who had forgotten what joy felt like and was remembering. "You are completely insane," she said. "You mentioned that." "Yes," she said, "and I am starting to think it might be a good thing." The next morning, Marcus made a decision, and it was the kind of decision that would change the rest of his life, and he knew it. When he made it, and he made it anyway. He walked to the station communication center, and he sent a message to every human ship captain he knew, and he told them what was happening, and he asked for help. Some of them laughed at him, and some of them called him crazy, and some of them told him he was going to get himself killed. But some of them said, yes, Captain Sarah Okonkwo arrived first with her freighter, the Distant Hope, and she took one look at the refugees in the cargo bay, and she rolled up her sleeves and started organizing supplies. Then came the Chum brothers with their converted mining vessel, and then Maria Santos with her passenger transport, and then more ships than Marcus could keep track of. They brought food and medicine and blankets and water recyclers, and they brought something else that was harder to define, and it was the sense that the refugees were not alone and that someone cared about what happened to them. Word continued to spread, and more refugees continued to arrive, and the salvage yard became something new and something that had never existed before. It became a sanctuary. The Dominion sent messages demanding the return of their property, and the human colonial government sent messages asking Marcus what the hell he thought he was doing, and various alien powers sent messages expressing concern and confusion. Marcus ignored most of them and answered some of them and kept doing what he was doing because stopping was not an option anymore. One night he stood on the hull of the Fortunate Son and looked up at the stars, and Valkyra climbed up to join him, and they sat in silence. For a while, the universe was vast and cold, and full of ancient empires that had been crushing people like Valkyra for longer than humans had existed, and by any rational measure what Marcus was doing was pointless. But humans had never been very good at rational measures. "What happens now?" Valkyra asked, and her silver hair caught the starlight, and her amber eyes reflected the distant suns. "I do not know," Marcus said, "and I suppose we keep going, and we help whoever we can, and we hope that it matters." She was quiet for a moment. "The Dominion will not stop," she said, "and they will send more hunters, and they will send ships, and eventually they will send an army." "Probably," Marcus agreed, "and you will fight them." He turned to look at her, and she was not the terrified creature he had found hiding in his ship anymore, and she was something stronger and braver and more hopeful. "Yes," he said, "and I will fight them, and so will the other humans, and so will you, and so will everyone we have helped, and that is what the Dominion does not understand." "What?" "That when you try to crush people, you make them angry," Marcus said, "and when you make them angry, they fight back, and when enough people fight back together, even the biggest empire in the galaxy has to pay attention." Valkyra considered this, and she looked at the stars, and she looked at the ships gathering in the salvage yard, and she looked at the humans sitting beside her. "Your species is very strange," she said. "I know you are stubborn and reckless, and you do things that make no logical sense. Also true. And yet," she said, "and here you are." "Here we are," Marcus agreed. Below them, the cargo bay of the Fortunate Son was full of sleeping refugees, and around them the salvage yard was full of ships crewed by humans who had come to help, and above them the stars burned cold and eternal. Somewhere out there, the Dominion was watching and waiting and planning, and they had no idea. What they were dealing with humans did not conquer through overwhelming force, and they did not win through superior technology. And they won because when they found something worth fighting for, they simply refused to stop. And Marcus Chen had just found something worth fighting for. The galaxy would never be the same. Valkyra leaned against his shoulder, and Marcus put his arm around her. And they watched the stars together. And for the first time in a long time, she was not afraid. "This is only the beginning," she said. "Yes," Marcus agreed, "and it is." And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, a message was spreading from ship to ship and world to world. And it carried a simple truth that the Dominion had never expected. The humans were coming, and they were bringing hope with them. And they were not going to stop